Hi guys. So for today's video, I'm going to be ranking, just purely based off of enjoyment, all of Sanderson'S Cosmere books. This is not meant to be taken really seriously, and also if you've not read the Cosmere books, this isn't necessarily saying that you're gonna feel the same way. This is just my personal feelings towards all of the individual books. I'm only really going to be talking about the main books in the Cosmere with two exceptions. I'm also going to be including Edge Dancer in this, and I'm going to be including Mistborn Secret History. Something's got to be at the bottom of the list, and that would be Mistborn Secret History, which you can find in this particular bind-up of short stories. I'm a huge Sanderson fan, but my nostalgia goggles are not so thick that I can't recognize that I really didn't care for Mistborn Secret History. To me, I felt that it didn't enhance my enjoyment of the first era because it is kind of correlating with the first era Mistborn books, and it kind of follows, the timeline of it follows along the timeline of the first era books. And I just felt like I would have been happy to have not read it. I know that it will likely play into some of the books that come out later in the Mistborn series, but overall, I just sometimes pretend I didn't read it. The next book, going from least favorite to favorite, would once again be in this bind-up, and that would be Edge Dancer. Something that both Mistborn Secret History and Edge Dancer kind of have going against them for me personally is that I really am not a fan of short stories. It's really difficult for me to like short stories because I like things to be elaborated on a lot, and I like really getting to know our characters. And Lift in Edge Dancer, we don't really get to know her that well, but her personality still definitely stands out enough, and she is a child, so there's only so much to learn about her because it's not like she has this really long history of a tragic backstory. Regardless though, I rarely like child characters, and Lift is not an exception, unfortunately. She is definitely a very entertaining character though, but I find sometimes very entertaining characters serve better as side characters, so following Lift for an entire short story just wasn't anything that really stuck with me. Along those same lines, the character Wayne from the second era Mistborn books is another character that he does happen to basically be a side character, but he's so close to being a main character that his extremely vibrant personality isn't necessarily to my liking. Sometimes it's so extreme and we get so much of him that I want him to take his personality down a notch. That would sound really mean if I was talking about a real human being, but because they're fictional characters, I can trash on them all I want. And with him, he's just so much sometimes, and I don't know if because I went back and forth between reading these and listening to the audiobooks, maybe the narrator, who I adore, I think Michael Kramer is phenomenal, but maybe he upped it a lot, so maybe upon reread I'll stray from picking up or listening to the audiobook and see if my feelings change towards Wayne in that regard. But Wayne is just so much, and honestly, Waxillium could have gotten a little bit of his personality because Waxillium is one of those people that if I did know him in real life, I would think, oh, he's a nice guy, I'd get along with him. But to read about, he's just so vanilla. I promise very quickly we're gonna go from me being kind of negative to me being over the top positive, and kind of right smack in the middle of all of that is my very neutral feelings towards Elantris. The story itself is very interesting, and I think the premise is fantastic, and I like the characters in this series a lot, but I think because I read this after reading Mistborn, First Era, and the Stormlight books, that I was used to Sanderson's voice, and with this book, his voice is not as prominent. And so I think I was just underwhelmed by that aspect. It felt a little more cookie cutter, and it didn't have his particular Sanderson polish on it. So I think upon reread, I'll have a better idea of weighing the book in my mind based solely off of its qualities as a book and not expecting those things of it. Next on the list, oh no, I'm very nervous to say this, but next on the list would be Oathbringer. I don't mind at all that this book is over 1,200 pages, but I found that sometimes there were things that I felt were not elaborated on enough, and then other times there were things that I was thinking, why the heck are we still here? Why is this taking so long? I also just don't know how things are going to resolve with certain characters in the next book, and if it turns out the relationships between some of the characters have already resolved, and it's not really going to be touched on in the next book, then that's kind of strange, and it's hard to talk about without giving anything away. But there's just there's 3 characters whose relationships are interesting, and I don't know how on earth the book ended with the abruptness in the commitments that were made, and the lack of commitments, and the lack of communication just was frustrating to read. Also, the Stormlight books I've found are very notable for having page-turning last chunks. The last 200 or more pages of these books are so incredibly non-stop, and that is so true of all 3 of them. But with this one, I was the most underwhelmed. I thought it was done better in the first 2, but I will say that there's a battle sequence in this one kind of early in the book that early in this book is like 3 books in, but it's not toward the end, it's in the middle, and I loved that battle sequence. We had a character who I was growing attached to, and the things that occur with that character I was heartbroken over, and seeing how another character, how he viewed everything was happening and how it affected him, it was so tragic. And there are so many things done well, including the backstory we get of one of the characters in this. So there's a lot of things that this book is going for it, but the other things I mentioned, I mean, oh my gosh, did they get under my skin. Next up, we have The Final Empire, which is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy. And I think this is one that's probably a little bit surprising that it's not ranked higher, but as much as I enjoyed the first book, and I think it's a fantastic first installment, I think it's a great book regardless, I just don't love it as much as I love some of the other books. The magic system is incredible. I think the 2 main characters of Kelsier and Vin are incredible, but it was not the kind of book that from the very beginning I was constantly wanting to flip the page and learn more. It was kind of a bit of a slow burn, and it was also my very first introduction into Sanderson's writing. So I was not used to the fact that it takes quite a while for him to establish all of the things that eventually you come to know really well. The next book would be Warbreaker. I don't currently have it on me, but Warbreaker, I just think out of all of Sanderson's Cosmere books is the most fun. I think Sanderson did a phenomenal job of taking some typical tropes that you see in a lot of fantasy and not necessarily flipping them on their head, because I don't know that he completely transformed the tropes, but he just did them right, and he had this sense of whodunit throughout the story. He had such a good amount of humor in it and political intrigue. Following that one would be The Well of Ascension, the second Mistborn First Era book. There is, of course, action. All of the Mistborn books have action, and I loved that, but this one had such a great dose of political intrigue with the action. And speaking of the battles in Stormlight, the battle in this book is one of the best I've ever seen. It was heartbreaking, and the consequences of the battle, you really feel them, and the characters really feel them. Alrighty, all that's left now are the top 3 spots, and honestly I could go back and forth between deciding if I really think that these should be in the places that I've put them, but I'm just gonna go ahead and go for it. And I'd say at number 3, Words of Radiance. I think the best way to talk about my rankings for these top 3 would be to also mention the 2 and 1 spot. 2 would be Way of Kings, and 1 would be Hero of Ages. I'm gonna talk about the Words of Radiance and the Way of Kings in comparison to one another, because it was really difficult for me to place these where I did and to put Way of Kings above Words of Radiance. But the thing that really put Way of Kings up a little bit on Words of Radiance is just the fact that in every Stormlight Archive book, we get one of the main characters' backstories, and the character's backstory that we got in the first book, I just like that character more. I also felt that the way the backstory in the first one is tied into present day was done better than the way the backstory in the second one was tied into present day. I just thought that the backstories for both of them were amazing. I honestly didn't know that the character whose backstory is told in the first one, I didn't think that Sanderson would give us a more tragic backstory, but then Words of Radiance came along, and my goodness. Some things though that I think make it so that these are almost tied would be that both of them have phenomenal battle sequences, and I think the way that this one's battles tie the characters together, I think the way that it pays off everything that has been happening before, I think that element of it is better. But with this one, we have the coolest moment for one of the characters. The quote by that character is just the kind of thing that just makes you cheer, and if you're reading in public, you gotta kind of keep calm because it was so cool and you're trying not to flip out. Another thing about these books is that Words of Radiance, we've already established the world, we've established the characters, and we've established them so well in Way of Kings. So by the time you get to them in this one, you don't feel like you have to trudge through a lot of pages of getting to know everybody and everything. You already are pretty familiar with everybody, and seeing how people's stories are intertwined is so much fun. On the back of the book, there's a quote from Patrick Rothfuss, and it says, "I loved this book. What else is there to say?" And my problem is, I have way too much to say, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on now to my number one pick, and that would be, like I said before, The Hero of Ages. There were elements of this book that I didn't love, and there were elements of this book that I just was sitting there like, I don't care about this particular plot line. Can we get back to our other characters now? That definitely happened in this book. But the ending, oh my gosh, it's still to this day my absolute favorite ending, not only to a book, but to a trilogy. And the way that Sanderson brings so many details together from the first two books that you would not think were even that connected is incredible. I just was in awe when I was reading it. I would get to those points and just not believe it. I was like, oh my gosh, he had planned the whole time. Like, cause books 1 and 2 seem so different from each other and they don't feel like they're that connected. And then you get to this third book and you're like, it was his plan all along. I know this book has its faults. I know it isn't necessarily probably Sanderson at his best, but the ending, I mean, this whole video is based off of my enjoyment, and I mean, weirdly, I could have put this book at the bottom because it broke my heart for so long, and I would think about it, and I'd get sad, and it made me feel more emotion than any book I've ever read. That is why I love the Mistborn First Era books so much. I've never, ever felt a stronger connection to the main characters and to the struggles they have to face, and cared about them more and been invested in their lives and what was happening and wanted them to succeed. I've just never had that more in any other book. So for enjoyment purposes, that is why this one is at number 1. So I know a lot of you are going to feel very differently, and I would love to hear your ranking of all of these books based purely off of enjoyment. If you'd like to see some more Cosmere content, I'll go ahead and link a few of the videos over here. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to check out my Patreon, and I'll see you all later. Bye.